Susan Breau, welcome to 7:30 South Australia.
Thank you.
Why does what you found matter?
It matters because there is such an issue these days with civilian casualties of armed conflict. And there's such a debate about how many lives are being lost during wars, and yet we don't really have the answer to that.
What have you found in terms of a state's responsibility?
I found that there are a number of responsibilities on any state that engages in armed conflict. And part of the responsibility is actually to search for casualties, which can be to the point where if there's been an explosion, to search for remains, to identify the casualty. Who is that person? Is it a civilian? Is it someone who was a terrorist or a militant, someone involved in armed conflict?
And this is a legally binding
responsibility. And the next responsibility is actually to notify their family, and that's one of the most important parts of the responsibility, is the right of a family to know the fate of its relative. And that's a human right, an international human right. And finally, to keep a record of the identity of the victim, the cause of death of the victim, and where the victim is buried, because sometimes the burial takes place in a location that is far away from the family members. So in the same way that military casualties are put in Commonwealth graves, the Commonwealth Grave Commission, and there's a record kept of who they were and where they're buried, my argument is for civilians the same thing should happen.
When you say that the states have a responsibility, and these are states who are engaged in conflict,
yes,
to record, to repatriate where necessary, to respect civilian casualties, what part of the state do you mean? Do you mean the military? Do you mean the civilian government? Do you mean perhaps non-government agencies?
That's a very good question. It could be either of any of those possibilities. It could be the Department of Defense establishing a separate agency, a sub-department of a Department of Defense. It could be funding a non-governmental organization, because in fact right now there are a number of non-governmental organizations that are actually recording civilian casualties, and so they could receive state funding. My argument though is that it is the state that's primarily responsible.
So the state also would have a very strong self-interest in not finding and not recording, because those things could be used in respect of any state to beat it over the head in a number of international fora, to be used by their enemies.
I argue exactly the reverse, that in fact when you don't account for civilian casualties, and this is what happened in the Iraq conflict, very much so to the parties that were involved, civilian casualties can be exaggerated, statistics can be done by one death could suddenly become 10 deaths. If you don't have an accurate record, the state can actually be accused of killing many more people than actually die in the armed conflict. So it actually can be in the interest of the state to record.
What states are likely to conform to this? And let's make an assumption here. I'm assuming it'll be states like Australia and Canada, where you're from originally, from the UK, the EU, maybe the United States. If those states do it, the Western states, to return to that other point, surely it gives those who are opposed to us a chance to beat us over the head.
It is an argument that could be made. I mean, it's not only states. I actually argue that groups such as the Taliban should be doing the same thing, that they have an international responsibility to account for their civilian casualties. And of course, the argument is, well, they're not going to do it. And some rogue states, let's say Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, will not do it. Syria will not do it. But do we really want to be in the same club as countries like that? I mean, the point is that we want to be respectful of international law, and by and large we are.
Well, indeed, but that's another point. Australia is respectful of international law,
absolutely,
by and large, and it's a signature to a number of international treaties. But my understanding is that we haven't actually gone that extra step and imported those into our domestic law. So when we talk about having the wherewithal, the legal wherewithal, to hold our military to account, we can't do it because we haven't done that extra step. We haven't recognised these international treaties in our domestic law.
Well, many of them have been, and Australia has enacted a number of pieces of legislation. But this specific obligation, I will agree with you, it's not been specifically put into Australian domestic law. There's a very important argument there. The argument is that we're all bound by what is called customary international law. And that is rules that do not have to be necessarily incorporated into legislation, but But as a good member of the international community, the states should be doing it because they conform with international law. And that's my field of specialty. I argue that states have an obligation that supersedes the domestic arena.
Are you going to be applauded for this work, do you think?
Well, I think I'll be criticized by some parties that this is going too far. Some states may argue that it's going to impose an undue burden when they're trying to fight a war, and then they have to worry about civilian casualties on the top of that. But I think that a state that is sensible and realizes that it's in their interest to account for the civilian casualties because they're trying to spare civilian casualties. So by doing this, they're showing the international community that they respect their legal obligations.
In your report, you name a number of cases that have gone before the European Court of Human Rights.
Yes.
A number of cases against Turkey, a number against Russia, one against the UK from memory. Have any of those countries that have had adverse findings in that court changed their ways?
Well, certainly the United Kingdom adherence to every judgment that's made against them. Turkey has also indicated they're going to comply with the findings of the European Court of Human Rights. Russia also has adhered to the jurisdiction, but I'm not saying the record is perfect. And Russia and Turkey are involved in armed conflicts. Turkey's involved in a conflict with the Kurdish peoples, and Russia's been involved in Chechnya. No, obviously they have a long way to go before they can comply with all of their human rights and humanitarian law obligations.
And back to putting our own house in order, what should Australia do with what you've found?
Australia should study the findings and should decide where they would place the responsibility, as you said, in the Ministry of Defence, on civilian government, or on a non-governmental organisation who may be tasked with this. But to save Australia the trouble at this point in time, my argument is that we should actually be having an international conference, because there could be actually an international organisation funded as well to do this for a number of states. In the same way NATO, for example, is a combination of a number of states. There could be an international civilian casualty recording organisation funded in part by Australia but other countries as well.
If we find and recognise all the civilian victims of conflict, do we help, or do we in fact add to the bitterness that's caused?
Think of the bitterness of family members who never know what happened to their relatives. What worries me is I think that we assume that by telling someone that their relative has died, that we're compounding the problem. I think we compound the problem when we don't tell families where their relatives are buried or how they died.
And feed future bitternesses.
And feed future bitterness and future conflict. This is important work because I believe in the long run it helps prevent armed conflict rather than support it.
There's another way of looking at it, though. Take the obverse way of looking at it, and that is we're talking about codifying and accepting civilian casualties as inevitable. 150 years ago, civilian casualties were considered unacceptable.
Yes.
We're now in a situation, and I'm wondering whether you're inadvertently adding to that, where civilians are recognised as a legitimate part, a legitimate weapon of war. Brutalising them is legitimate, but if we find them afterwards, if we say who they are, if we bury them properly, that's okay. Surely it's not.
No, it's not okay. And certainly one of the issues, and you mentioned it earlier, that states are concerned about, and it's true, and I'm going to acknowledge this, that sometimes you will identify a civilian casualty who shouldn't have been killed. And I'm not suggesting that civilian casualties are a likely consequence of war. In fact, at all costs, states should try and spare civilian casualties. But there are occasions where civilians are with a militant who is preparing a bomb, for example, or engaged in a conflict, and there could be a civilian close by who unfortunately is also killed. And those are the casualties that are important to be recorded as well. But no, I'm not suggesting that this would make killing civilians easier in armed conflict. In fact, there's a very strict obligation to distinguish between those who are combatants and those who are civilians.
And if we do this, will we have a better world?
Well, I don't know, but I hope so. I hope this makes, I truly believe that international law and following the rules of international law does allow people to live in dignity. And that's my primary goal, is that we have a dignified world and hopefully a more peaceful world.
Susan Breau, a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for joining us on 7:30 South Australia.
Thank you.